Leader with Deputy Rory Hearn. Thank you. Now, Deputy Mary Lou McDonald, under Standing Order 38 to begin Leaders' questions. Deputy McDonald.
Taoiseach, yesterday I raised with you the scandal of big energy companies shamelessly ripping off and gouging households. And I outlined how the latest report from the International Energy Agency highlights that Irish energy bills are 3 times higher than the wholesale cost of energy. The cost of energy has dropped significantly since 2022, but these companies are not passing on savings to hard-pressed customers. Instead, they pocket the savings to boost their own massive profits. Proof of Irish households being so blatantly ripped off should provoke the head of government into action, determined to rein in these companies. So I asked you a very straight question. What will you do to end this rip-off? And in response, you offered absolutely nothing. Having already withdrawn energy credits, you now shrug your shoulders as households are taken for a ride and as more than 1 million households face big hikes in their electricity bills this month. People are very worried. I spoke with one woman last night who's at her wit's end. She and her husband have 3 kids. They both work and they are worn out from paying rip-off bills. This woman is up to 90, wondering how she'll afford increased electricity bills this winter. And she told me that she fears they'll go into arrears and that they might face being cut off because she simply doesn't have a euro to spare. I was contacted recently by another mother. Her husband works full-time. She says the unaffordable cost of childcare prevents her from working, but this is what she wrote to me. She said, "Our ESB bill became so high over the past 2 years that we were left with no choice but to switch to a prepay system just to ensure the electricity wasn't cut off. I am extremely worried now as we face winter. We can't afford oil to heat our home. We are drowning in bills and we are struggling to stay afloat." Taoiseach, this is what the rip-off means in real life, and you allow it to happen. In other EU states, governments ensure that their regulators have full oversight of the hedging practices of energy companies. But your government is happy to take companies at their word. That is weak and at best naive. We produced a bill that would provide the regulator with such powers. We've been raising this matter for the past 3 years. You should, of course, implement this legislation and start putting manners on these companies. Tá Fianna Fáil agus Fine Gael sásta sí siar tada a dhéanamh agus ligand dus na cólachtaí fuinneamh las a winch as Chowley na Heran. Dúiltaí an rialtas seo seasamh son Ibrethe agus Chowley agus i gcuine an sal fuinneamh. In almost every other EU state, the drop in wholesale cost of energy is being passed on to the customer. Households are getting a break, but it's not happening here. This disinterested, out-of-touch approach from government can't continue, Taoiseach. Yesterday you said that you recognise and accept that there is price gouging happening. Back in July, when you were challenged here on the floor of the Dáil, you said, "We have the guts to take on anybody who is engaged in price gouging." Absolutely. But so far, this government has been gutless. So you're the head of government. Do your job. And can you please tell households what exactly you will do to protect them from this blatant gouging and this blatant profiteering?
Díon téim leis an méad atá ráite ag an hachta. Mar leis an méad atá dhéanamh ag an bhiltas ó heamh an diasca an bhrú. Atá a churs faointe na tíre mar leis an ordú san costas marachtála agus ad a bhíam. Ghuiile ardú ann go háire gursaí bia agus cuasaí fuinnimh. Agus tá cinenne dénta an bhiltas, cáir agus takeíocht a chóirt do dhaoine ícom ísre agus atá ag brath leis a hóisiúlaigh. Just want to say at the outset that the government is very, very conscious of the enormous pressure on people on the ground in respect of cost of living increases that have occurred over the last number of years, and particularly the elevated food prices relative to previous times and energy prices. And that is why in the budget we moved to take a number of key decisions to reduce pressure on a number of families, and particularly low-income families and those who depend on social protection, and families more generally, because you know that historically the VAT rate was at 13.5% for gas and electricity. And in the budget, we reduced it to 9%, and now we've made that applicable up to 2030. So it'll stay at 9% for the next 5 years. That comes with considerable cost, but we have to do it, otherwise prices would be up even higher. And we've increased the fuel allowance to €38 a week, and that's a 15% increase. And that will give an additional €140 to over 460,000 recipients. And that we've expanded that payment to include those in receipt of the working family payment. So we haven't stood back. We've been very conscious in our budgetary measures to try and protect those most in need from the effects of energy price increases, which we acknowledge and which are difficult in themselves. We've also have a very significant retrofitting budget, which does help those who benefit from that in terms of their household energy bill. About €558 million has been allocated this year for residential and community energy schemes, and particularly the Warmer Home Scheme, about €280 million. These are very significant sums and resources that have been allocated to get households, the energy costs down. About 8,000 energy upgrades in low-income households happened as a result of the Warmer Home Scheme. And then in previous years, yes, we did universal energy credits. We've been criticised for the high level of public expenditure. You want to go another 4 or 5 billion, which would add 2% to inflation, which would increase cost of living for people. We know we're about the 8th highest in terms of electricity prices across the European Union 27, adjusted for purchasing power parity. The Minister has met with the companies, and we don't want anyone in arrears will be helped. People will be helped and assisted who are in arrears outside if they're in higher income thresholds. We have a regulator in this country, the CRU. They've published a report in 2023. They're very conscious of the hedging policy. They argue, and it's the CRU, not me, are arguing that when prices went up, the hedging impacted beneficially. But it is slow coming back down, and companies should reduce the prices and should reflect much more quickly the wholesale price reductions. And the Minister will continue to engage with those companies. And what has to happen overall is the system has to change, and he has set up a group to change the regulatory framework, and we have to do it also with the European Union, because gas has been the price setter. That is the fundamental issue. The overall regulatory framework across Europe that governs the price of energy.
So wholesale prices are down considerably by over 70%, and that reduction isn't being passed on. So bills are rising. Energy companies are profiteering, turning huge profits, and government is sitting idly by. Families and workers are struggling and struggling hard, and government sits idly by. Too lily-livered, or maybe too indifferent to bother to intervene and take this on. You acknowledged yesterday, I noticed your language is rather more watery today, but you accepted yesterday that blatant gouging is occurring, blatant profiteering. You surely accept that families are struggling in the midst of a cost of living crisis. And I want to know what you're going to do about it. You're not a commentator, you're not some passive bystander, you are the Taoiseach, you are the head of government. Tell me how you will put a stop to this blatant gouging and profiteering. Tell me the precise actions that you propose to take, Taoiseach.
Again, look, you're operating from a prepared script, and that's very obvious, because I've just outlined the measures that we have taken. I've just outlined the measures that we've taken to help people, particularly those on low incomes, which I'm sure you agree with, by the way. I'm sure you acknowledge that the increases in the fuel allowance, the expansion of it into the working family payment cohort, the reduction of the VAT to 9% on a more for the next 5 years. I'm sure you welcome all of that and acknowledge that those are decisions that the government has taken. And we will continue to help people in particular who are in difficulty here. Well, I think, sorry, with the greatest respect, no, you think you live in the real world, but there are times when I think you live in a political bubble. And you shouldn't be casting aspersions on other people in the House, okay? We all come from backgrounds, by the way. I know exactly what the real world is all about, and I engage with people all of the time. But I'm telling you, with respect to your, I mean, all along on the energy crisis, the proposals that you came forward with, particularly during the energy crisis, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, would have been catastrophic what you proposed at the time. Would have been catastrophic. And you want us now to do more to underpin the companies. You want us to support the companies further and further and further.
Ivana Bacik, Deputy Ivana Bacik.
I want to begin by welcoming developments for peace in Gaza, as I know we all do, and hope that we will see the start of a path to real peace for all in the Middle East. Taoiseach, I think we can agree we're all living in the real world, and in the real world it is, I think, a good thing that we're having a debate about energy prices. I think it's a good thing we're debating the cost of energy, but cost of energy is a misnomer, because the prices being inflicted by energy companies on households are reflecting practices of gross profiteering, and they're far detached from real costs. Energy providers are not behaving as though their product is a public good, and the true cost is being paid by hard-pressed families and households, people who are toiling through a cost of living crisis and who saw the budget come and go last week with, it has to be said, Taoiseach, almost no reprieve or relief for them or for their household finances. And that's why we see executives at the energy companies reaping record rewards. And just to remind you, Flowgas have hiked their prices by 7% after their parent company recorded operating profits of €820 million. Bord Gáis, after a year in which they made €75 million in profits, is adding €218 a year to the average bill. Pinergy almost 10%, despite having increased revenues by nearly 40% last year, and Energia increasing electricity prices by more than 12% after €154 million in profits last year. Taoiseach, I'm reading this from a script because it has to be read into the record. Pushing more households into fuel poverty is a high price to pay for what is clearly the hoarding of wealth by energy companies. Yesterday and today, you've pointed out that energy credits are pocketed by energy companies, and that's why they needed to go. But your analysis misses the point about the support that households get from such credits. And the reality is that in last week's budget, you've pulled the rug from beneath thousands of struggling families as winter bites. And you have not used the time during which those measures were in place to bring in more sustainable supports. And that's why we're seeing so many households in arrears, Taoiseach, and that's the reality. For Labour, our support for targeted energy credits is grounded in reality, in the need to support ordinary households who are being punished for the failures of government to bring down energy prices. Your government, it seems, was well able last week to ignore economic advice when it came to tax breaks for developers and indeed for VAT cut for one sector, which will cost €681 million without any evidence that it will save a single job or a single independent business. Yet when it comes to energy credits, a lifeline for people, it seems you're suddenly slaves to undergraduate economics. You say you want more efficient solutions, but Taoiseach, we in Labour always offer constructive solutions. Deputy Kieran Ahern has pointed out to you, under the EU electricity and gas directives, price regulation is allowed in exceptional circumstances, for example, to protect vulnerable customers. So why aren't you using that mechanism to rein in the greedy energy companies? Why aren't you using Section 10 of the Electricity Regulation Act 1999? Taoiseach, will you take the powers available to you to help struggling households with energy bills this winter?
First of all, I understand the pressure on households and families as a result of energy price increases. We are living through a period of huge issues around energy ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in particular. And government has intervened, particularly at the height of that crisis, in a very substantial way. But retail prices are influenced by several factors, as you know, including wholesale energy prices and supplier hedging. And in Ireland, our long-standing reliance on fossil fuels, specifically gas for electricity generation, has been a driver of higher energy costs. That is a reality, Deputy, I'm sure that you'd have to acknowledge. It's a fundamental problem with our energy mix. And our location as an isolated island, our low density and widely dispersed population also influences prices and has necessitated a very substantial investment in the grid. And the programme for government did commit to an independent review into the speed and level of pass-through from wholesale prices to retail prices, with an additional assessment of the overall price dynamics and an overall focus on the competitiveness of our economy. And so the Minister did establish the National Energy Affordability Task Force to identify, to assess and to implement measures that will enhance energy affordability for households and businesses while delivering key renewable commitments and protecting security of supply and economic stability. And that task force will be reporting or publishing an interim report shortly, and again look at measures to support customers throughout 25 and 26 and the forthcoming winter. But more crucially, will provide recommendations in respect of structural reforms which can be undertaken to reduce the cost of energy and electricity, because there has to be structural reforms. I know politically and everybody wants to have the usual soundbites and have a go at this and have a go at that, but it's a fundamentally structural issue we have and how energy market and prices are determined. And the Minister will continue in the meanwhile to engage with the companies, and we in government then will take measures to protect people, particularly those in the lowest incomes. Those on the highest incomes, you're saying we should still continue with the energy credits. You're not saying targeted. You
have your rebuttal in a minute.
You didn't say it there. That word wasn't used there. And you're playing to the gallery to a certain extent. But I do acknowledge the issue. And like you mentioned VAT reductions. It costs to keep VAT at 9%. And so we factor that into the next 5 years. And we should keep it at 9% in terms of gas and electricity. But there is a problem here. There's a huge issue here. And it's an issue, that we have to invest triple what we invested in the last 5 years in the grid over the next 5 years. So there's going to be more investment in the grid, which there simply has to be.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
In terms of guaranteeing energy security and supply.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Bacik, now is your opportunity.
I absolutely reject the idea we're playing to the gallery. And with respect, what I've heard from you doesn't do anything for the 300,000 households in arrears with electricity bills, the 185,000 in arrears on gas bills. You're talking about reviews and task forces. I do agree structural reform is needed because, of course, what we're seeing is the liberalisation of energy markets has failed. Competition has not delivered fairer prices for consumers. Energy companies are not competing with each other to reduce prices for consumers. Rather, a price hike by one seems to be giving an excuse for a price hike to the rest. So we do need structural reforms, but where are they? Why aren't we seeing, for example, a levy on the profits of energy companies where they are not reducing prices to consumers? I've read you out the record profits that they're reaping, Taoiseach. Why aren't we seeing action by government to target them? Why aren't we seeing the sort of action I've listed to you that is possible under powers you have? And crucially, why aren't we seeing more action on a moratorium on disconnections? We've got for vulnerable consumers a moratorium from November to March. Why not banning all disconnections for all households for 5 months over winter? As a stopgap measure, while we're bringing in structural reform.
The Minister is working with the companies in respect of to help families that are in difficulty, in particular in arrears, in terms of the establishment of hardship funds, in terms of making sure that there won't be disconnections. And that's over and above the measures we've taken for the working family payment to increase the fuel allowance there and to increase the fuel allowance more generally. So the Minister is and has engaged with the companies in respect of those in arrears, and particularly in terms of no disconnections throughout the winter period.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Now, Deputy Holly Cairns.
Margaret Cairns. Taoiseach, the scenes of joy and relief in Gaza and Israel over recent days have been wonderful to witness. In particular, the release of hostages on both sides yesterday was incredibly emotional. But it struck me once more that even in this fragile peace, Palestinians continue to be dehumanised. Many of us have learned the names and personal stories of the Israeli hostages who were rightly released. However, there was no similar coverage for Palestinian hostages, many of whom were never charged or convicted of any crime. Despite this, they've been referred to by international media as prisoners. Their illegal internment and torture in Israeli prisons never mentioned. We'll probably never know their names or learn their stories, how some of them spent years, even decades, in Israeli detention without charge, only to return to a wasteland yesterday where Gaza used to be, to discover their family members had been wiped out in the genocide. Taoiseach, of course, we hope with all our hearts that this genocide is over, but we also have to face reality. 5 Gazans were murdered by Israeli forces yesterday morning, just 2 days after committing to a ceasefire. The simple fact of the matter is that the crimes and barbarity of the Israeli government predate October 7th and in all likelihood will not come to an end with this peace deal. For decades, Palestinians have suffered under an apartheid regime and brutal occupation. In the West Bank, where Hamas does not have a presence, there were more than 1,000 violent settler attacks in the first 8 months of this year alone. This is why Ireland also has a duty under international law to end all trade with illegal Israeli settlements. The government had promised to enact its own version of the Occupied Territories Bill, which would do just that. But you have been slow walking its passage all year and refusing to commit to including services along with goods as part of this legislation. And then yesterday, you told the Dáil that the feedback you were getting is that services are, quote, not implementable, meaning a huge component of trade between Ireland and the illegal settlements will continue if this bill is ever enacted. Taoiseach, we need to see action and we need to see accountability. If you omit services from the Occupied Territories Bill, it will be against the advice of the Oireachtas Foreign Affairs Committee. It issued a report in July and recommended that services were included. You also have a letter from more than 400 lawyers and legal academics stating there is no reason services cannot be included, not to mention the strength of feeling amongst the general public. My questions, Taoiseach, are why is the government intent on diluting the Occupied Territories Bill? And we've seen today that you can act really quickly and clear Dáil schedules for confidence motions when you want to.
Taoiseach,
why won't you act with the same urgency to enact the Occupied Territories Bill?
First of all, could I say that we earnestly hope that the peace will sustain in Gaza, and it's extremely important that every effort is made to get huge volumes of humanitarian aid into Gaza, clean water, clean fuel, in sufficient quantities to enable the people of Gaza to feed themselves, and that the United Nations and all its agencies would have primacy in distributing those goods, and that there would be sufficient deconfliction in Gaza to enable humanitarian workers and medics to do their work without threat of violence or worse. And that is, to me now, the most significant issue facing the people of Gaza, that aid goes in unhindered, in line with the peace deal. And I think the release of the hostages is a big moment, and it should be acknowledged. They should never have been taken as hostage in the first instance. They were attending many of them were attending a music festival. And there should be no, and I'm not saying you are, but there should be no equivocation about that. And likewise, illegally detaining Palestinians without any trial or without any evidence base is also wrong, 100% wrong, and shouldn't be condoned. And the Irish government, by the way, has been to the fore. And if you talk to the Palestinian Authority, I will answer the questions, but you've made assertions, and I'm entitled to make assertions and make our point, which is that the Irish government has been one of the strongest advocates for the Palestinian cause, for Palestinian self-determination, and you will never acknowledge that. And you keep on having a go at the government all the time about this aspect or another aspect. But the reality is very clear, and if you talk to the Palestinian Authority or Palestinians, they will say that. They will say that. In relation to the Occupied Territories Bill, and what I've said, and I've been saying this for quite a while, and by the way, I've read the Oireachtas report, and in fairness, it makes the point. The Joint Committee notes that no data was available to it to ascertain the quantity of services imported from the occupied Palestinian territories, and recommends that the Minister attempts to obtain and publish the information. So it doesn't know. You use the phrase huge. No one knows. It's not huge. We don't know. The Joint Committee notes that potential repercussions from the international community in terms of both international relations and economically are, to quote the committee, unknowable, and recommends that the Minister undertakes efforts to establish and publish a range of likely scenarios. So, in terms of goods, goods can be traced fairly easily through documentation, certificates of origin and physical supply chains, okay? Services are a much different kettle of fish, and we should all acknowledge. I'm just being honest. Just being honest, that's all. That's all I said yesterday. No decision has been made in relation to services or not. But I'm just endeavouring to be a bit honest with people. So financial consulting, software development, digital services, they don't have a clear territorial link. So there are issues there that we need to work through if we're honest about this.
Taoiseach, time is up. Deputy Cairns.
Taoiseach, we've been discussing banning trade with illegal Israeli settlements for years now. The Occupied Territories Bill was first published in 2018, so this government and previous ones have had a long, long time to consider all of these issues, and it's not a really long piece of legislation for that matter either. And I think just the level of talking down the clock and kind of briefly approaching the question at the end is just, it's such a waste of everybody's time. This is leaders' questions, and leaders' answers is implied with that. My question is, are you going to include services? I do recognise that services are different to goods. That's why I'm specifically asking you about services and not goods. If you could answer the question, I would honestly really, really appreciate it. I think the strength of feeling out there is extremely strong, and I think the public deserve to know where government parties stand on the Occupied Territories Bill in advance of the presidential election, which is coming up quickly.
Thank you, Deputy. No mention of
the presidential election is not is about the person who people believe is the best person to hold the presidency for the next 7 years.
Deputy Taoiseach, we're not discussing the presidential election.
Well, sorry.
It's a salient ruling. Thank you. On both parts.
I'm just responding to the Deputy. And I just want to make the point, Deputy, that, I mean, I'm not working, I mean, this government has done a lot, right? Internationally, through the various international legal fora and so on like that. And we have sought advice on one aspect, but I've referenced in the House on a number of occasions. The objective here is not to punish Ireland. Now, I read out that section from the Oireachtas Committee in terms of repercussions for multinational companies based in Ireland. What will be the repercussions for them in the United States? Because of,
please, Deputy.
Because of boycotts and divests. There's an issue there. And is it beyond us?
It's not a back and forth.
Is there something wrong with raising that issue and just surfacing that issue?
All
I'm saying is, Deputy, there are very There are very real issues that we should be clear. All I'm simply saying is this. There are very real issues here that we should be clear, please, one second, that we should be clear-eyed about, is all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
Time is up, Taoiseach.
And I would simply say this. We have been to the ICC, we've been to the ICJ, we have achieved a lot in respect of highlighting and profiling this.
Deputy
and I think
Peadar
it's wrong that you should constantly undermine and denigrate the government
Deputy
in respect. I genuinely do.
Deputy Peadar Toibin.
I can't call you. Taoiseach, yesterday the Scoliosis Advocacy Network and the families of the children affected by the scoliosis crisis gave a presentation in the AV room. Mothers told of the deaths of their children. They told about the continuous extreme pain that many children felt. Others told about lungs being crushed and stomachs being crushed. They told about their children being disabled for the lack of treatment. Images were shown of rods that were inserted breaking through the skin of the children. We heard of children suffering from infertility, from higher rates of cancer because of the lack of treatment. And indeed, parents of Harvey Sharrett, a 9-year-old boy who died during the summer, having waited for years for an operation, they also spoke in the AV room. And you must recognise, Taoiseach, that it is outrageous that parents in such a circumstance have to pour out their own grief over and over again in the public domain to shock the political system into dealing with this particular issue. The group also spoke about the toxic management culture in CHI, the bullying of staff, the bullying of parents. One parent alleged that CHI falsely referred their child to TUSLA because that parent was active in seeking treatment for their child. We were told of the spending of taxpayers' money without oversight, the insertion of unauthorised springs into children, the hundreds of children going through operations that weren't necessary, and then the other hundreds of children on waiting lists as well. And we were told that not all of this is in the past tense, that much of this is still in the present tense as well. So CHI have descended into dysfunction over the decade because of the lack of transparency. 12 reports have been written into CHI. Many of them are still not published, and many of them castigate the continuous disaster within that organisation. In 2017, Simon Harris promised that no child would wait longer than 4 months for an operation. This wasn't an exceptional promise. It was a promise to implement what is an international norm. Simon Harris failed in that promise, and so too has every single Minister for Health. Now, there's no accountability without a cost for wrongdoing. Real accountability can be the catalyst for change, and this is an issue that your government keeps missing. And I believe this government is allergic to that accountability. Look at the ballooning of the National Children's Hospital. Today we learn in the papers that the completion date for this €2.24 billion hospital will be missed for the 16th time. An incredible situation. Now, next week, we propose to bring about a motion of accountability. But your government has actually brought forward a motion of no confidence to this week. And I believe it's a cynical political trick to ensure that voters will not be thinking about the government's abysmal record with these children while they go to the polls in the presidential election. Now, the timescaling of any debate by a government on the basis of this is absolutely wrong. Now, I'm asking you today to tell the families that have been campaigning so far that there will be a statutory public inquiry with the power to compel people and parents. And will you tell these children and these parents that they'll no longer have to wait for this life and death treatment?
Taoiseach, before you
First of all,
Taoiseach, before you respond, there's a salient ruling of the House. I would ask deputies on both sides to respect it. There will be no mention of the presidential election. We have agreed under salient rulings the President's office is above debate. That includes nominees or mentioning the election. Both sides of the House, please respect the salient ruling. Thank you. Now, Taoiseach, please.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. First of all, I, along with many in the House, and I offer again my deepest condolences to Harvey Merson Sherritt's family, to parents Gillian and to Stephen, and to all those who have lost children in difficult and in very challenging circumstances. And I acknowledge and I accept that we need to do better in respect of the children of this country, and particularly in terms of access to timely health care. Optimally, every child should receive treatment and a surgical intervention when it's recommended by the clinicians at the right time. You know, I don't. It concerns me that children are waiting much longer than they should be in terms of surgery, and particularly in terms of spinal surgery, in terms of scoliosis. And the objective is, from a government perspective, is that we consistently improve capacity in terms of human capacity, in terms of surgeons, anaesthetists, and the entire teams that create the capacity in a children's hospital to do the surgery that is required. Also, better governance within hospitals, and particularly within CHI. There have been quite a number of reports that have painted a very difficult, to say the least, picture in respect to some aspects of what has happened within CHI. But there has been, those reports have been commissioned and have been published. And I do understand the anger, and I do understand the frustration felt by many parents and children. And I think communications between clinicians and between hospitals and parents should be a primary consideration and needs to improve. And there can be many challenges along the way and along the journey of any child that requires hospital treatment and that requires surgery. And notwithstanding expertise and how special and the various specialism, basic communication with parents is something that can never be relegated as a priority. And there have been issues in respect of CHI in that regard. A fundamental decision has been taken by the Minister for Health to bring CHI under the aegis of the HSE. I support that strongly, and I think it's important in the light of what has emerged. I believe Minister Harris has acted in good faith, Deputy, all along in respect of this. I think he made his commitment in good faith based on interactions he would have had with the health authorities at the time. And we're going to continue to prioritise this area in particular,
Thank you, Taoiseach.
on all aspects of this area, in terms of surgical capacity, in terms of governance,
Thank you.
and in terms of communications between
Thank you,
families and clinicians.
Deputy Peadar Toibin.
Taoiseach, I asked Simon Harris 13 months ago how many children were taken off the waiting list for scoliosis treatment. 13 months later, Simon Harris doesn't know the answer to that question. That's an incredible situation. An incredible situation. You talk about the folding of CHI into the HSE. I welcome that. That's something we push for. I had this debate with you yourself. But the truth of the matter is, unless you get to the core of the dysfunction at the management level, it's not going to make a whit of difference. I also welcome the fact that there is an investigation into this, but the truth of the matter is, so impervious is the management to CHI into transparency on this issue, that unless you have tools to force them to come before that investigation and to force them to provide papers, it's not worth a hill of beans. It is absolutely necessary that you can give a commitment to the families today that we're just not going to go through the motions in terms of these actions, that these actions will mean something. And the other aspect of this, Taoiseach, is accountability has to be imposed on this government. If there's no cost to these actions by ministers, there's no change.
Thank you,
and people are cursed to wake up morning after morning
respond.
to these situations happening over and over again.
Time is up, Taoiseach, to
I
respond.
just say that the Minister has met with, and the Taoiseach has met with Gillian and Stephen and the advocates in respect of any potential inquiry and the structures of that inquiry, and there'll be further meetings in respect of an inquiry. There are a number underway into specific aspects within CHI. Ideally, they should inform whatever structure and nature of an inquiry emerges, but we have to be very clear-eyed about that too, and honest with people in terms of timelines and in terms of a whole range of issues. And the fundamental objective is to improve services and to get timely access for children to surgery. And I accept we're all accountable, but it's only 9 months since this government was elected by Dáil Éireann as a government. Sorry, please, 9 months, and the people in the last general election voted for everybody who's in this House. And we formed the government out of the last general election. That's a fundamental point, by the way, that shouldn't. But motions in themselves, Deputy, motions are not going to improve services. I don't believe.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Proper
Time is up.
examination through
Thank you,
inquiries, yes.
deputies, and that concludes leaders' questions.